Imagine a country with fewer than 3 million people stepping up to China, the world's second-largest economy, and saying, "This is your last chance." That's exactly what happened. A senior Lithuanian official publicly declared that China must be given one last opportunity to resolve what Lithuania called a national security threat. The language was firm, moral, and confrontational. The kind of tone you'd expect from a major power, not a small Baltic state that could fit inside a single Chinese province dozens of times over. To put the imbalance in perspective, Lithuania's population is smaller than many Chinese cities. Its entire economy is roughly the size of one mid-level Chinese tech company. Yet here it was, speaking as if it could pressure Beijing from thousands of kilometers away. At first glance, the confidence almost feels admirable, a small democracy standing up for its values. But almost immediately, something feels off. Because in geopolitics, power isn't measured by words, it's measured by leverage. And here's where the story gets strange. After all that tough talk, Lithuania didn't double down. Instead, it quietly began sending signals that it wanted to fix relations with China. Months passed, then more months. Nearly half a year went by. Beijing's response was not anger, not threats, not even rebuttals, just silence. So now we're left with three unsettling questions. How did Lithuania end up confronting a superpower in the first place? Why is it suddenly eager to restore relations it once seemed willing to risk? And why is China refusing to even respond? This story isn't really about pride or diplomacy. It's about what happens when a small country misjudges power and how quickly moral posturing can turn into an economic survival crisis. And to understand how Lithuania got here, we first need to understand what kind of country it is and why its choices carry such heavy consequences. To understand why this confrontation mattered so much, we need to understand what kind of country Lithuania is and what it depends on to survive. Lithuania is a small nation on the eastern edge of the Baltic Sea. If you look at a map of Europe, it's easy to miss. Its land area is about the size of West Virginia, and its population is under 3 million people. That makes it small not just by global standards, but even by European ones. Politically, Lithuania is deeply embedded in the Western system. It is a member of the European Union, part of NATO, and uses the euro as its currency. For national security, it relies heavily on the United States and the broader NATO alliance. In terms of values, rhetoric, and voting behavior, Lithuania almost always lines up with Washington and Brussels. But here's the critical part. Lithuania's economy depends on trade and connectivity. The country sits at a strategic crossroads between Eastern and Western Europe. Its ports on the Baltic Sea, its railways, and its logistics hubs are designed to move goods, not just for Lithuania, but for the wider European market. Think of it like a small but important transit bridge. It doesn't produce everything itself, but it helps move other people's products efficiently. This makes Lithuania highly sensitive to disruptions. Large countries can absorb shocks. Small countries usually can't. When trade routes shift, supply chains break, or markets close, the pain shows up quickly in factories, ports, and paychecks. That's why small states usually act carefully in great power rivalries. They can choose sides, yes, but every alignment comes with costs. And when those costs are miscalculated, the consequences don't stay theoretical. With that context in mind, the next part of the story becomes much clearer. Because in 2021, Lithuania made one symbolic decision that would turn its strategic position from an advantage into a vulnerability, and set off a chain reaction no one in Vilnius seemed prepared for. The breaking point came in 2021, and on the surface it looked almost trivial, just the name of an office. That year, Lithuania allowed the opening of a new institution in its capital, the Taiwanese Representative Office. To many people outside diplomacy, this might sound like a minor detail. After all, countries host trade and cultural offices all the time. But in this case, one single word, changed everything. Under the widely accepted One China principle, most countries that do not officially recognize Taiwan avoid using the word Taiwan in official office names. Instead, they use Taipei, as in Taipei Economic and Cultural Office. It's a deliberate compromise, a way to maintain unofficial ties without signaling recognition of sovereignty. Lithuania broke from that convention. By insisting on the word Taiwanese, Lithuania crossed a red line for Beijing. From China's perspective, this wasn't about trade or culture. It was about political recognition and territorial integrity, which China treats as non-negotiable core interests. What made the situation worse was that this wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding. China issued clear warnings ahead of time. Lithuanian leaders knew the sensitivity, and yet they went ahead anyway. Then came the follow-up moves. Lithuania began publicly criticizing China's 17+1 cooperation framework with Central and Eastern European countries, calling it a tool to divide Europe. Soon after, Lithuania officially withdrew from the mechanism altogether. Taken together, these actions sent a strong message. Lithuania wasn't just making a technical adjustment, it was making a political statement. For China, this wasn't a naming dispute. It was a challenge to a core principle. And while many expected Beijing to respond with loud condemnation or dramatic retaliation, what came next was far more unsettling. Because China didn't argue, it didn't negotiate, it didn't even publicly escalate. Instead, it went quiet, and then it moved. When countries clash, we usually expect noise, angry press conferences, public threats, diplomats trading insults. But China did none of that. There were no dramatic speeches, no official trade war declarations, no fiery headlines warning Lithuania of consequences. Instead, Beijing responded with silence. Then quietly, something inside China's trade system changed. In late 2021, Lithuanian exporters discovered that their country had disappeared from China's customs declaration system. The option to select Lithuania was simply gone. Without it, companies couldn't file paperwork. And without paperwork, goods couldn't enter China, even if they were already sitting at Chinese ports. Exports froze overnight. Ships carrying Lithuanian products were denied clearance. Containers sat unopened. Some shipments weren't even allowed to dock. For businesses, it felt like hitting an invisible wall at full speed. The examples were brutal and concrete. A shipment of tens of thousands of bottles of Lithuanian alcohol was rejected outright. Large volumes of dairy products were forced to turn back after reaching Chinese ports. By the time they returned home, the goods had spoiled and were unsellable. For small exporters, this wasn't just a setback, it was financial shock. Contracts vanished, cash flow stopped, warehouses filled with products that suddenly had nowhere to go. What made it even worse was the uncertainty. There was no official notice explaining the rules, no timeline, no negotiation channel. Companies didn't know whether this would last days, months, or forever. That uncertainty created panic. Businesses realized this wasn't symbolic punishment. It wasn't meant to send a message and then ease off. It was structural pressure, built directly into the system that controls access to one of the world's largest markets. And as Lithuanian companies scrambled to understand what was happening, they soon discovered something even more damaging. This pressure wouldn't stop at their own borders. At first, Lithuanian leaders framed the crisis as a narrow trade dispute. Exports to China had stalled, but surely the damage would be limited. That assumption didn't last long, because the pressure didn't stop with Lithuanian products. China's trade controls began affecting entire European supply chains that touched Lithuania in any way. If a product contained Lithuanian-made components, even if it was assembled in Germany, France, or elsewhere, it could still face delays, inspections, or outright rejection when entering the Chinese market. For European manufacturers, this created an immediate risk. And in global manufacturing, risk is something companies eliminate fast. Major firms quietly began cutting Lithuanian suppliers. Some were directly advised to reduce or stop sourcing from Lithuania altogether. Orders were canceled. Contracts weren't renewed. Small and medium-sized Lithuanian companies, many of them invisible to the public, suddenly lost the clients that kept them alive. Think of it like removing one bolt from a machine. The machine doesn't explode instantly. It starts to shake. Then parts fail. Then the whole system slows down. Factories closed. Bankruptcies climbed. Thousands of workers lost their jobs. Within a short period, hundreds of businesses were gone. Not because they made a political choice, but because they were connected to one that did. Then came the logistics blow. Lithuania had been a minor but important node in the China-Europe rail network. Freight trains moved through its rail hubs toward ports and onward into Western Europe. After the dispute, China suspended direct rail routes involving Lithuania. Trains were rerouted through neighboring countries like Belarus and Poland. The result was devastating. Rail freight volumes plunged. Port activity dropped sharply. Revenue collapsed. This wasn't one sanction. It was a chain reaction. Trade, manufacturing, logistics, employment, all unraveling from a single political decision. And as the economic damage mounted, Lithuania's room to maneuver grew smaller by the month. Which brings us to the next phase of the story, when the crisis moved beyond money and into the realm of diplomacy and human consequences. As the economic damage spread, the diplomatic relationship between Lithuania and China didn't just weaken, it collapsed. First came the downgrade. China lowered relations with Lithuania from the ambassadorial level to the much lower chargé d'affaires level. Ambassadors on both sides were recalled. What remained were only a handful of staff, just enough to keep the lights on and the doors technically open. Then, even that minimal structure began to disappear. Negotiations stalled. Communication dried up. Disputes over trade, visas, and public statements piled on top of each other. By mid-2024, the situation reached an almost unheard-of point. The last registered Chinese diplomat left Lithuania. When he later tried to re-enter, his documents had expired, and he was stopped at the airport and deported. At that moment, China's embassy in Vilnius effectively became an empty building, a sign on the wall with no one inside. This is where the story stops being abstract. Lithuanian media later confirmed that Lithuanian citizens were being held in Chinese prisons, suspected of violating Chinese law. Under normal circumstances, consular officials would visit them, check on their treatment, coordinate lawyers, and communicate with families. But there were no diplomats left to do that. Families were left waiting, anxious, and powerless. The Lithuanian government admitted publicly that there was little it could do. No embassy meant no access. No access meant no leverage. In the most basic sense, the state could no longer fully protect its own citizens abroad. What began as a political statement had now reached the level where real people were paying the price, quietly, far from cameras and speeches. And as troubling as that was, the pressure didn't stop there. Because even inside Lithuania, daily economic life was starting to feel the consequences of diplomatic isolation. By the time the full cost became impossible to ignore, Lithuania's tone began to change. A new government took office, and with it came softer language. Senior officials started speaking about dialogue instead of confrontation. Statements appeared expressing hope for normalization, cooperation, and mutual respect. The message was clear. Lithuania wanted to reopen the door. Month after month, these signals continued. But on the other side, there was still nothing. No response from Beijing. No meetings, no statements, just continued silence. And that silence revealed the core problem. While Lithuania's words had shifted, its actions had not. There was no public apology, no policy reversal. The Taiwanese representative office sign was still hanging in Vilnius, unchanged. From China's perspective, this mattered more than tone. In Beijing's view, Core interests are not negotiable, and symbolic gestures mean nothing if the underlying issue remains untouched. Friendly language without concrete steps was seen not as compromise, but as avoidance. Silence became a tool. By refusing to engage, China kept all the leverage. Every passing month increased pressure on Lithuania's economy, its companies, and its citizens, while costing Beijing very little. For a large power, time is often an advantage. For a small state under strain, time is an enemy. This moment exposes one of the hardest lessons in international politics. Once a red line is crossed, reversing course is rarely quick or painless, especially when the balance of power is uneven. And that brings us to the final question. What does this case really tell us about the world we're living in now? When you zoom out, this story is no longer just about Lithuania. It's about what happens when small countries operate in a world dominated by big powers, where symbolism, values, and strategy collide with economics and reality. Lithuania believed it was making a moral stand, aligning itself clearly with Western values, democratic principles, and its allies in Washington and Brussels. And in many ways, it did exactly that. But this case shows a hard truth of modern geopolitics. Values don't cancel out consequences. In a multipolar world, power is fragmented, but leverage still matters. China didn't need to fire a shot or issue threats. It simply used access to markets, supply chains, logistics, and visas, as pressure. For a small, trade-dependent economy, that pressure was overwhelming. So the real question isn't whether Lithuania was right or wrong. The real question is whether small nations can afford symbolic politics without economic backup. Can moral positioning replace trade diversification? Can alliance guarantees offset lost markets and broken supply chains? And when governments make bold geopolitical choices, who actually pays the price? Politicians or ordinary workers and families? This story offers a quiet warning to other small states watching closely. In today's world, choosing sides isn't just about values. It's about preparation, resilience, and understanding how power actually works. If you found this analysis useful, share your thoughts in the comments. Was Lithuania acting on principle, or did it miscalculate the costs? And if you want more deep dives into the hidden consequences of global power struggles, make sure to subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay with us. Because the next story might not be happening in Lithuania. It could be happening somewhere much closer than you think.